Welcome back. I'm Nancy Grace. Thanks for being with us here for ID's special report, The Long Island Serial Killer. Joining me to continue discussion of the case, Derek Levasseur, a decorated police sergeant and detective from Central Falls, Rhode Island, four-time Emmy Award-winning journalist, Mara Campo. She's on the case since 2017. Documentary maker Josh Zeman, whose film The Killing Season highlights the Gilgo Four and other victims 5 years after their bodies found. And joining us, Joseph Scott Morgan, renowned forensic expert and star of a hit series, Body Bags, with Joe Scott Morgan. Let's talk about the evidence as we know it now. First of all, straight out to you, Joe Scott Morgan, I'm very curious your take on the evidence as we know it, and specifically, what about potential bind markings on the female victims' bodies? And I'm referring to antemortem or postmortem, and how do you make the difference?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Nancy. And I've been thinking about this for some time because we've heard about these bindings. We don't have a lot of specificity when it comes to them. But one of the things that we want to consider, particularly in the world of an alleged serial killer, was any of this stuff perpetrated ante-mortem? That is, you bind someone in order to restrain them so that you can perpetrate whatever you might want to perpetrate upon them in a fixed position. And then afterwards, if you're talking about postmortem bonding, where you're tying up the bodies, this sort of thing, and you're entering into this kind of make-believe world, here's the problem. If you've got bodies that are so decayed, that are in such an advanced state of decomposition, I've heard the term skeletonization thrown around quite a bit, there is evidence of binding. But the reality is this: if you don't have focal areas of hemorrhage that tie back to soft tissue where you get contusions, bruises, and that gives you an indication of antemortem activity, as opposed to, say, postmortem, where you could bind something, but it's not going to display any kind of hemorrhage, particularly if there's no soft tissue left.
Joe Scott, very simply put, if binding took place on the victim's post-mortem, their heart is no longer pumping. Therefore, there would be no bruise mark, possibly a laceration of some sort from a rope, but highly doubtful, as opposed to antemortem or before death, where you would see those bindings. But because some of these bodies were actually skeletonized, the only way I see that we can get a COD, cause of death, is if they were shot or stabbed and it nicked a bone. We're not hearing that. My best bet is asphyxiation. Agree, disagree?
Yes, I agree. I fully agree, because I think that even though he's got this cachet of weapons that have been found in his home, that, if you have a gunshot wound, you're going to have this demonstrated, particularly on the skull, and absent that, you're left to think, well, is this an asphyxial related death? Many of the serial crimes that I have worked over the course of my career have involved various different types of asphyxiation. I've had perpetrators use garrotes, where they wrap around the neck and tie it off multiple times and twist it. They can manipulate this. This is a form of torture. It's been used for centuries. And you also have a standard ligature where they can use a cord or a piece of rope, or you can have manual strangulation, where it's called throttling, where you reach forward, you can squeeze the life out of somebody.
Joe Scott.
Or, yeah.
Joe Scott, whoever killed these women dragged it out. The murder was part of the torture. These women were begging to live. They were begging to get back home that night to their children. They were hookers. They may not have even told the police about it. They just wanted to live. And when you're talking about ante-mortem and post-mortem and the ligature and this, and these are women, mothers, daughters, and the clinical way you describe it, well, I guess it has to be that way. Let me talk to you about the location of the bodies. Joe Scott, if Heuermann is guilty, if he is, every day he'd drive right past his trophy garden planted there at Gilgo Beach. Have you ever seen anything like it?
Not particularly in this configuration. However, I have seen multiple cases where serial killers prefer a specific area of deposition, and that is where the bodies are deposited in very simple terms. And many times this goes to a familiarity with an area, certainly a level of comfort. If you can get into an area that is under the cover of darkness, you can either get in there by a motor vehicle relative to a car, or perhaps you can access this area vis-a-vis some kind of watercraft, and kind of get into that area, drag a body there, and dispose of it. And also the way the bodies are deposited, the position that they're in, relative distance from one another. Is there any posing going on? And that's why you have to be very careful working these cases and collect everything. And one other point, Nancy, since at least 3 or 4 of these bodies, there's burlap associated with that. That means that you have this kind of cocooning that's going on with the remains. And we talked about asphyxial deaths just a moment ago. I'm really curious if these bodies were contained and they're in a skeletal form, if they were able to recover hyoid bones. Because in that case, if you're talking about a manual strangulation, that is the one case where you can have this hyoid bone that's very, very high in the neck. You'll see it fractured many times. It's a bird-shaped bone. It doesn't articulate with any other bone in the body. It literally anchors the tongue in the back of the throat, and that's his sole purpose. It's very delicate, and you have to get up very, very high to do this in strangulation. That would be an indicator. Of course, we haven't heard that to this point.
Judge Scott, when you're talking about the hyoid bone, you're talking about
Yes.
the bone right here, right at the bottom of the neck. I'm really curious about the evidence you believe that will be in those burlap bags. And that leads me to the other victims. You've carefully reviewed this. Every serial killer to date that has been actually confirmed, serial killers do change their MO, modus operandi, method of operation. It is entirely reasonable to believe that the Manorville butcher and the Long Island serial killer is one and the same. Do you disagree?
No, absolutely not. I don't. And a lot of that is geographic proximity, Nancy. And that goes in. I know that we're talking about 2 separate locations, but come on, give me a break. They're not that far apart, and you begin to think about a familiarity with an area. And again, I hate to keep drumming on this, but it's the idea of what does the perpetrator, what's their level of comfort in this environment? Because I'm even referring to things like timing of traffic patterns. They know when they can go to these locations, when they're going to have the cover of darkness. They also know where they can pull over on the shoulder of the road and go unnoticed and this sort of thing. The one thing that really, you talk about how serial killers will change their MO many times. And yes, that does happen. However, when you have cases, and there are these cases that are out there that involve dismemberment, I think that it's important to know, if you look at the so-called Gilgo 4 and this kind of cocooning that goes on with the burlap, that gives you an indication that the individual wrapped the bodies in some location and then merely deposited them there. We don't know necessarily what happened to them prior to that. When you get to dismemberment, you have to think, you have to have a quiet, you have to have an equipped, you have to have a sequestered area in order to perpetrate this. Think about that just for a second. We're talking about a secured area. And if you're using a power tool, you'll have to have a power source. This is not an undertaking that should be entered into lightly, because it takes time. And if you don't have anatomical experience, like people like myself that have spent years and years working in the morgue and this sort of thing, and we have the right tools, Nancy, to do this. If you're talking about utilizing things like hand tools, carpenter saws, that sort of thing, skill saws, I've seen chainsaws, you have to have a quiet place to do that. And also, again, getting off into kind of the profiler area, do they take pleasure in doing this? So those 2 cases, those 2 types of cases where you have dismemberments and then the cocooning, they're different. They're different. And you think about dismemberment, did they have time with these bodies? Well, they certainly had enough time. Certainly in Karen's case, the Jane Doe number
Vergata.
7 that has just been identified, thank God. You found her legs. They found her legs in one location in Fire Island, and then her skull is found
At Gilgo.
such a far piece away. And I got to tell you, Nancy, I've entertained this thought: was the skull held onto for a protracted period of time, since '96 perhaps, and then tossed out of a window, taken out there and put alongside the rest of these bodies? Because it is a long way. I'm not, obviously, you can hear my voice. I'm not from Long Island, but I took a look at a map. There's no direct way to get to Fire Island. You have to go inland and then back over. So
Well, Judge
you would
Scott,
have to be
it's
purposed to
not
do this.
unheard of. Remember, Bundy kept the victim's head and performed sex acts with it, and much more. So what you're saying is not unheard of. Another issue, we learned tonight that all we're waiting on for an indictment of Heuermann regarding Maureen Brainerd Barnes, the fourth of the Gilgo Four, is a DNA result.
Yeah.
It's got to be Heuermann's DNA they're waiting on.
Joe, I wanted to ask you about '96 because you referenced it with the Manorville killings, and I know that we have hairs on at least 3 of the Gilgo 3, and as you just said, as Nancy just said about Maureen, we're just waiting on the DNA from that. Are you concerned that if there is trace evidence, there is DNA evidence for these other victims, that due to degradation being a much longer period, I know we have mitochondrial DNA testing we can do, but are you concerned that even though we have that, because of the length of time and because of those outside elements, even if there is hair follicles, that they may not be able to get a strong enough sample to do the sequencing?
Yes, I'm very concerned about that. If there is one tripping point in these cases and their connectivity, it's all of this time that has transpired. Now, listen, God bless this task force. The sheriff was on here earlier. That man has done a fantastic job. But time, as any investigator knows, and certainly those of us in forensics, is our biggest enemy. So when you move further and further down that timeline, you're losing things. You mentioned the term degradation. It does degrade. And so at the end of the day, you're left with this mitochondrial DNA that comes from the hair. Now, listen, we can do a lot more with that today than we could, say, back in 2007. But, and if wishes were airplanes, we'd all be flying. If they had taken the steps back then, we'd be in a different position right now. But it's too late for that. So yeah, that's going to be the biggest tripping point relative to this. And Nancy, to your I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, I have to wonder, when you're talking about any evidence that would still be remaining after all of this time, and you mentioned the dismemberment, the location where a potential dismemberment would have taken place, would there be any evidence that's left behind there? For example, blood that's soaked into floorboards or concrete or on the power tools. Is that a potential avenue for evidence that would have survived almost 30 years?
Yeah, absolutely, it could be. And it all depends on if they can pinpoint those locations. And look, we've talked a lot about the house. You guys have, I'm sure. But here's the thing. We have to think, and my mind goes back to these storage facilities. I'd like to think that a good, thorough search has been done in all of these areas. If there is trace blood evidence that is there in those locations, it could have been perpetrated there if you're talking about dismemberment or any kind of structure like that. But again, depending upon the tools that you're using, you have to have an electricity source. And back to the dismemberment, one of the biggest keys here, and this is quite fascinating when you think about it, is I think that a group of people that's going to play a big role in this case moving forward are going to be our tool mark experts. Because when you begin to think about all of these strikes, these marks that are left behind on these dismembered remains, I'll be very curious to see if there is connectivity between these dismemberments and a specific type of tool. Like I said, and like many other people, I'm certainly not the first person to say it, serial perpetrators they'll use a kit that they prefer to use. They get used to it. It's like I hate to say this, but it's like a carpenter. You have certain tools that you use. With them, if they prefer a hacksaw, a meat saw, whatever the kind of saw it is, that's going to leave back a specific trace on these tool marks. These bones that they have that they would have recovered from, say, the dismembered remains, I would imagine that they have been sent not only to the New York State Crime Lab, but also to the FBI to be examined for tool marks and tool strikes on there, because this would have taken some time to do. And you're going to leave a very distinctive marking behind. Here's the key. What tools did they recover out of the storage sheds?
Yeah.
What did they find at that home? And they're going to be doing comparison. That's another thing that they're waiting on. Remember, they talked about that they just have now started to unpack all of this evidence. My God, when you think about what could be in that house as far as a tool that might be associated with dismemberment, that could be a bombshell in this case.
Joseph,
Josh
we
Zeman,
also
I really want to hear what you
yeah,
have to say
well,
about
we
that.
also know that number one, he was a woodworker. He learned it from his
Yeah.
father. And you know, we were talking before about the belt, and we were talking before with Carrie about BTK and her generational abuse, and everything that you guys are all saying, it just keeps coming up, this idea of the father, this generational abuse. We were even talking before about the bodies. Remember, Maureen Brainerd Barnes was found with a belt, right? And that belt had theoretically Rex Heuermann's grandfather's initials on it, right? So he learns woodworking from the father. You know, they don't have the greatest relationship. The father apparently called Rex, he got angry for him not being a go-getter. And so now we're learning about the generational woodworking, and then the fact that even the father took Rex to Gilgo Beach to go duck hunting. So somehow this is all tied together in a very weird generational abuse issue.